Macbeth remained hunched in his chair, imagining the fearful deed that lay before him. His dark thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Banquo and his son Filance. Banquo had brought a gift from the king, a beautiful diamond for Lady Macbeth, whom King Duncan had called his most kind hostess. Macbeth inwardly groaned. Could he really murder this man, this king, this giver of gifts and sweet compliments? I dreamt last night of the 3 weird sisters, said Banquo. To you they have showed some truth. I think not of them, lied Macbeth, trying to end the conversation. When Banquo left him, he dismissed the last of the servants and tried to prepare himself for the foul murder. He paced up and down the great hall, trying to gather courage, but then he saw a phantom dagger hovering in front of him. Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand? He cried. Meanwhile, Lady Macbeth, fearing her husband's courage would fail him, had decided she would have to murder King Duncan herself. She crept into his room and looked upon the sleeping guards. That which hath made them drunk hath made me bold, she whispered. Satisfied that they would not wake, she took their daggers and raised them above the king. But just as she was about to plunge the daggers downwards, she looked at his face and froze. King Duncan looked so like her own father that she felt her courage leave her. She dropped the daggers and fled from the room, shaken by her failure. Lady Macbeth ran to find her husband, for time was running out, and the guards would soon wake from their stupor. She waited outside while Macbeth crept into King Duncan's room. Reluctantly, Macbeth picked up the daggers. Closing his eyes, he plunged them into King Duncan's heart. Then he ran from the room, his hands dark with the king's blood, and the daggers still clenched in his fists. I have done the deed, he cried, overwhelmed with the horror of it. Why did you bring these daggers from the place? Cried Lady Macbeth. They must lie there. Go carry them and smear the sleepy grooms with blood. Macbeth would not go back. He was too afraid to see what he had done. Infirm of purpose, cried Lady Macbeth, furiously. Give me the daggers. She grabbed the daggers and ran to return them to the grooms, covering their hands and faces with blood for good measure. Later, when King Duncan's body was found, the whole castle rocked with cries of murder and treason, for he was the most noble of sovereigns and was loved by all. Macbeth's guilt made him feel that all eyes were upon him. He was terrified of being discovered, so claiming vengeance, he killed both the guards before they could be questioned and reveal their innocence. Oh, yet I do repent me of my fury that I did kill them, he said. Despite his display of grief, many suspect that Macbeth, aided by his wife, had murdered the king. The king's 2 sons feared for their own lives and decided to flee from Scotland. Malcolm to England and Donalbain to Ireland. Sir Macbeth, as next in line to the throne, was crowned King of Scotland. He had achieved his ambition and had also fulfilled the witch's 3rd prophecy. Thou hast it now, King Cawdor Glamis, all as the weird woman promised, Banquo said to himself. And I fear thou playest most foully for it. Macbeth was haunted by the fear of being discovered, as well as his own guilt. He worried that Banquo would find proof of the murder, or that somehow Banquo's descendants, and not his own, would one day reign, just as the witches had foretold. To be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus, he muttered to himself. Our fears in Banquo stick deep. Macbeth decided that the only way he could hold on to his crown and to pass it on to his own children was to murder Banquo and his son Filance. To this end he invited all the local thanes to a feast. As Banquo and Filance made their way to the palace, they were brutally attacked by Macbeth's hired assassins. Filance managed to escape, but Banquo died. "Oh, treachery! Fly, good Felance, fly, fly, fly!" cried Banquo as he lay dying. "Thou mayest revenge." In which Macbeth receives a visitor. Oblivious to this horrific deed, the other thanes were merely dining with King Macbeth and his queen. Macbeth was tense and nervous, but tried to put aside his guilt. Then, just as he stood to give a toast, Banquo's bloody, wounded ghost appeared and silently sat down in Macbeth's seat. "Which of you had done this?" asked Macbeth in horror. But neither the thanes nor the queen could understand what he meant, as they could not see Banquo. "Thou canst not say I did it," shouted Macbeth at the spectre. "Never shake thy glory locks at me." There was an uncomfortable shuffling amongst the thanes, and some made to leave. "Why do you make such faces?" whispered his wife. "When all's done, you look but on a stool." Macbeth was so unnerved by the ghost and the wounds it bore, which had been inflicted by his own henchmen, that the queen finally dismissed their guests, pretending that the king was sometimes afflicted by strange visions, in which further prophecies are revealed. From then on, both Macbeth and his queen began to suffer long, sleepless nights, filled with hideous dreams. Macbeth's wife, who had been so bold and ruthless, began to feel that she would never wash the blood of guilt from her hands. Yet both were still obsessed with keeping the throne. Macbeth decided to return to the heath, to seek out the witches and ask them what the future held. Macbeth set out across the heath on another night of thundering skies. He finally found the 3 witches in a cave, chanting over a cauldron of boiling hell broth. "Round about the cauldron go, in the poisoned entrails throw. Double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble," they cried. As Macbeth stood watching, 3 apparitions rose from the cauldron. The first was an armed head, which warned Macbeth to beware of Macduff, the Thane of Fife. The second was a bloody child who told Macbeth that no man born of woman could harm him. The third was another child, wearing a crown and holding a tree, who reassured Macbeth that he would never be vanquished until Great Birnam Wood came to Dunsinane Hill, where Macbeth's castle stood. When Macbeth asked if Banquo's heirs would reign, the cauldron sank into the ground, and 8 ghostly kings passed by. Followed by Banquo's ghost, the last king carried a mirror, which showed many more kings, and Macbeth knew that they were Banquo's descendants. It was as he had feared. Banquo's son Felance had escaped. In which Queen Macbeth is racked with guilt. Macbeth's visit to the witches had done nothing to make him feel that his crown was safe. If anything, he felt more insecure than ever. So when he heard that Macbeth had gone to England to join forces against him with Prince Malcolm, Macbeth ordered the death of Macduff's wife and children. A messenger cried this terrible news to Macduff in England, and he was stunned. He heard the words but could hardly believe the horror of such a deed. "All my pretty ones, did you say all?" he cried. "What, all my pretty chickens and their dam, at one fell swoop? Nothing could ever wipe out the desolation of such a loss. Let's make us medicines of our great revenge to cure this deadly grief," said Malcolm, now that they were more determined than ever to reclaim the crown for such an unworthy king. This terrible murder of innocent children and their mother lost Macbeth many friends. He and his wife began to feel increasingly isolated, and their guilt grew. Though Queen Macbeth, as she now was, had the crown she had longed for, her life had become a living nightmare. She wandered the castle trying to wash the blood of King Duncan from her hands and clothes. Blood that had long gone, but blood that haunted her still. "Out, damned spot, out, I say," she cried. After days and nights of the queen not sleeping or eating, her servant called the court doctor. but he had no medicines to ease her guilty mind. "Here's the smell of the blood still," cried the Queen, as the doctor and waiting woman looked on helplessly. "All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. Oh, oh, oh!" Eventually, Lady Macbeth was unable to bear the ghastly visions any more, and she died. Macbeth now felt more hated and alone than ever. His wife had been his guiding force, his partner in crime. "She should have died hereafter," he groaned. "There would have been time for such a word." In which Macduff and Macbeth come face to face. Macbeth was still reeling from his wife's death when a soldier who had been on watch approached him. "I should report that which I say I saw, but know not how to do it," he said nervously. "Well, say, sir," cried Macbeth impatiently. "I looked towards Birmingham, and anon methought the wood began to move." "Liar and slave!" cried Macbeth furiously. But the watch was not a liar, for thousands of Prince Malcolm's troops were fast approaching, shielded behind branches cut from great Birmingham wood. Thus it appeared that the wood moved towards Dunstan Hill and Macbeth's castle, the event the witches said would precede Macbeth's downfall. Macbeth still believed himself invulnerable, even if great Birmingham wood appeared to be moving towards his castle. He knew he would never be killed in battle. Hadn't the witches said that no man or woman born would ever kill him? So, gathering his courage, he railed his remaining forces and waged a bloody war against Malcolm's forces until Macduff spotted him. "Turn, hellhound, turn!" cried Macduff, his sword held high. Macbeth turned, and as their swords clashed, Macbeth cried out, "Let fall thy blade on vulnerable crests. I bear a charmed life which must not yield to one of woman born." "Despair thy charm," cried Macduff in triumph. Macduff was from his mother's womb, untimely ripped. Macbeth's sword slacked in his hand. Macduff had not been born by natural means. He had been taken from his mother's womb by surgeons. Macbeth knew that this meant his end had come. Macduff, with all the pain of his lost family in his sword, made sure his enemy's death was swift and bloody. With one sword stroke, he parted Macbeth's head from his body and then carried it to Prince Malcolm, the rightful heir to King Duncan's throne. "Hail, King, for so thou art!" cried Macduff triumphantly. "Hail, King of Scotland!" So Prince Malcolm claimed back his father's throne, and the Scottish people rejoiced. The wicked reign of Macbeth and his ambitious wife had ended just as had been prophesied. Scotland was once at peace, ruled once by a true and noble king.